does it take to leave a leadership legacy that spans generations? What does it mean to lead with purpose, not just in the boardroom, but throughout life? Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. Today's guest is Martha C. Lawrence, a longtime editorial collaborator with Ken Blanchard, and author of the forthcoming biography, Catch People Doing Things Right, How Ken Blanchard Changed the Way the World Leads. In this conversation, we'll explore the life, philosophy, and enduring impact of one of the most beloved voices in leadership, and how his lessons apply not only to business, but to a life well lived and well led. Martha, you have worked very closely with Ken Blanchard for more than 2 decades. What drew you to him, and what kept you working alongside him for so long?
Well, first of all, before I start, Jeff, thank you so much for this extremely helpful podcast. I'm a fan. I love the topics you cover, and I love the contribution you're making. So I just want to begin there and just acknowledge you for a great podcast. So thank you for having me.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you.
What drew me to Ken Blanchard? Well, like so many people, I first heard about Ken Blanchard in the early 1980s when he published a book that pretty much revolutionized the way people are managed at work, called The 1 Minute Manager. And, Brene Brown, who is very popular now, she talks about how somebody handed her the 1 Minute Manager in the 90s when she worked in her first management job at AT&T, and that book really taught her what it meant to lead others and sort of defined what leadership was for her. And I think there's a whole generation of people who, whether they know Ken Blanchard or not, have been influenced by his concepts. He really, again, revolutionized leadership. So I knew of him. I was an editor in New York in the 1980s, and I had been writing a series of mystery novels. Fast forward to the late 1990s, early 2000s, I've been writing all these mystery novels, and after 9/11, I felt called to do something more meaningful. Not that there's anything wrong with writing mystery novels. I love them. I love a good murder mystery. But I was feeling a calling to make a bigger contribution. And right around that time, I learned that Ken Blanchard was looking for someone to help him, an editor. And I'd had many years of experience as an editor. So I had the opportunity to work with Ken, and I jumped at the chance. And for readers who don't know Ken Blanchard, I think it might be worthwhile to kind of give a encapsulation of who he is. He grew up in New York. He was educated in New York schools, went to Cornell University, became a university professor. He had this incredible ability to take complex ideas and turn them into really actionable, fun concepts. It's just kind of a genius that he had to take complex ideas and turn them into something simple. And when he was on sabbatical from his university professorship, he was giving a speech to some executives, and it was so successful that they basically coerced him into starting his own company. And he said, "How am I going to start my own company? I can't even balance my own checkbook." And they said, "We'll help you." So he started a company. Shortly after he started it was a management development company. He published The 1 Minute Manager, which spent 3 years on the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list, sold millions and millions of copies around the world. And so that is who Ken Blanchard is. He basically changed how we think about leadership. Prior to Ken's work, leadership was really thought about as something you did to people, not something you did with people. It was about authority, rather than influence. And Ken's teaching is all about leadership is about influence, not authority. It's about working with people, controlling people. So anyway, that story was worthy of writing a biography about somebody who had accomplished all that. But what really inspired me to write this book was that I worked closely with Ken and saw that not only did he preach these principles of serving others and lifting others up, but he really lived those. I mean, he He is the real deal. And there are so many biographies out there about business leaders who have done amazing things. No shade on them. They're great. We've got the Steve Jobs, we've got the Elon Musk, we've got, Henry Ford, whoever it is. But they're so often, they sort of teach an underlying message that you have to sort of push and shove to get ahead. And Ken's story is about somebody who didn't push and shove to get ahead. It's about nice guys being able to finish first too. So I felt that was a story that needed to be. Sorry for the long-winded intro there, but
no, that was a beautiful intro, and it gives me kind of chills because as we've talked about before we started recording. My dad was a management consultant. Those books were on his shelf. I've read them so many times when I'm just looking for a book to read. I think I commented many times how I've been influenced by my dad's perspective on leadership, which is again the same thing. His book was never near as popular as any of Ken Blanchard's book was Catalytic Management, and I can't help but know that my dad was very much influenced by Ken Blanchard as well, and so in turn I was influenced.
It's so interesting that you mentioned your father. There's two things come up for me there. So often, when people think about leadership, they think about a position. But you just said you were influenced by your father. Leadership is an influence process. That's what Ken teaches. So anyone who is in a position to influence others is a leader. And a lot of our greatest leaders have been moms and dads, actually. And like you, Jeff, Ken's father was a huge influence in his life. He retired as a rear admiral in the Navy, so he fought in World War II, some really, really tough battles in the Pacific theater, lost like 70% of his men. Tough stuff. But he was a great guy, and Ken was interested in leadership early on. As a kid, he was very popular in school, and he did a lot of student government. And so the first leadership lesson he learned was from his father. In seventh grade, he ran for president of the class, and he won the presidency of his seventh grade class, and he ran home, and he was all excited to tell his mom and dad, "Hey, I won the presidency." And his dad said, "Ken, that's great. You won the presidency of the class, but now let me teach you a lesson about leadership. Now that you have that position, don't ever use it. People follow leaders not because they have a title, but because they respect them and they trust them. So just act in a way that's trustworthy and respectable, and that's what leadership is." So another story from Ken's childhood with his dad, they lived in New York, and they used to go to Giants games, and Ken's dad took him to, I think it was a Giants-Cardinals game. And he said, "Now, Ken, when you watch this game, I want you to watch two players in particular. Enos Slaughter, when he hits the ball, notice the way this guy hustles." He said, "If you're going to do something in life, be like Enos Slaughter and really hustle. Really hustle." And he said, "The other guy you should pay attention to is Stan Musial. Stan Musial, no matter what the umpire does, if he makes a bad call, he's always a gentleman. So those are two guys you should model yourself after." So Ken took not only those lessons away from that, he also took away the reality that you didn't need to be a president of a corporation or a political figure to be a leader, that you could be a baseball player and lead, because, how you comport yourself is actually leadership.
So catch people doing the right things is such a powerful phrase. Why did you choose that as the title for the biography?
Catch people doing things right. Ken was asked by somebody, if you could only take away one of the teachings you've given over the years, which one would it be? And he said it would be catch people doing things right. And there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot has to do with his research on what truly motivates people. And when he wrote The 1 Minute Manager, he talked about 1 minute praisings. The research is that when you praise someone, you actually raise the endorphins in their body. When you criticize someone, it shuts them down. And so that's part of the reason. So So catch people doing things right is something we need in the world. Somebody, Ken used to say, who needs praising? Everybody who's breathing. So that's why the book is called Catch People Doing Things Right.
So what made Ken's leadership philosophy so different and so enduring compared to other management theories? I mean, I could probably list a whole bunch of, management authors in that same period of time, but they didn't capture the same level of, I don't know what the right word is. You're the writer, but,
Yeah, well, the subject of, it might seem dry and boring management, and Ken was able to take those theories that he developed. He was a professor for many years at Ohio University and University of Massachusetts, and where he developed these actually very substantive theories. But the bottom line is he was able to take leadership and turn it into something that everybody could relate to. And so just getting back to praising, like Jeff, when was the last time you praised your wife?
Oh, you would pull that up, Probably not as often as I should. And, she would probably tell you I do the opposite. And that's why I was feeling so convicted when you started talking about that, because we tend to, praise people furthest away from us. We're not as quick to give praise to the people right next to us. And yeah, I'm sitting there feeling about,
I don't want you
smaller.
I don't want you to beat yourself up, Jeff, and here's why. As human beings, one of the reasons our species has survived is we are problem-solving machines. We are wired to find what's going wrong in our environment and jump on it and fix it. So we are wired to catch people doing things wrong. That's just in our wiring. So it's actually a very deep principle, catch people doing things right, because we're trying to counter our own innate wiring. So don't beat yourself up. And then also, a lot of people have a resistance to catching people doing things right, because it's like, oh, if you say, hey, thanks, good job, like the manager who's like, hey, great job, team, it becomes shallow. And Ken talks about how appraising has many parts. You don't just say, hey, good job. You sit down with a person or stop for a moment with a person, tell them what they did that you're going to praise. Maybe it's, my partner taking the garbage out. Honey, thank you so much for taking the garbage out. When you did that, I felt so supported. I had so many things going on that day and was feeling in complete overwhelm. And when you stepped in and did that, it gave me such a feeling of relief and just reminded me why I love you so much, or whatever it is for you, and you can incorporate that into all day long and just watch the energy level rise, watch the vibes get better and better. And it's contagious too. When you catch other people doing right, they will catch other people doing things right. And it becomes a positive chain reaction.
I actually tried an experiment in my classes this past term, and it didn't go as well as I had hoped. But I had Dr. Rob Kelly on We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast. He's considered the Gordon Ramsay of addiction therapy, and very colorful guy. But he was talking about how he could change somebody's life by just commenting on their sneakers. And it's like, he's got such a great idea that I'm going to try something in my classes where at the start of every class, everybody has to turn and compliment at least one person in the class. And at first the students were all like, and then they kind of got into it, but then it kind of got a little bit overdone for them. But I'm hoping that at least to a certain extent, they walked away from that thinking, okay, if I just give somebody a positive note, it can change their day.
Exactly. I'm thinking when you told that story, I'm remembering watching Ken speak publicly. And one of the things he used to do at the beginning, you'd have this giant room filled with 1,000 people, and to show people the power of positive interactions, he would say, okay, before I begin, I want everybody to stand up. I want you to turn to the person next, or I want you to walk around the room. And as you run into people, act like you have something better to do and that you're too busy to say hello to them. Just basically ignore each other. So the room, everybody walks around and is basically dissing each other. And then he says, okay, now we're going to do something else. Now I want you to walk around the room, and instead of ignoring the person you're passing by, I want you to act like they're a long lost best friend and you're so happy to see them. And the energy level in the room, it just explodes with good vibes. And, it's kind of a brilliant speaking device because, first of all, he gets the audience kind of energized to listen to what he has to say, right? And also it shows people, sort of a demonstration of what he's talking. So people are so cynical, though. We really have to get over our cynicism. It's like, just try it. Just try it. Yeah.
I can do better. I know that. So what do you think is the most misunderstood part of his philosophy?
Well, again, I think the most misunderstood part of leadership in general is that leadership is about power and control when in fact it's about influence. And, another misconception people have, and this is a criticism Ken has heard all his life, is that that's really nice, but we live in the real world. And to be in business, we have to make money. And, you can't be a nice guy and necessarily be solvent. So, for example, Jack Welch, the former chairman and CEO, the late chairman and CEO of General Electric, was sort of infamous for his philosophy of hacking off the bottom, firing the bottom 10% of the company every year, just like it's dead weight. And Ken just rankled at that idea. He's like, you don't go out and hire losers. Why would you fire 10% of your workforce? That's ridiculous. In fact, Ken's philosophy was that if there was something wrong with a performer, oftentimes what his research found was that the manager was the problem, not the employee. Very often that's the case, So, or maybe that employee is in the wrong position for their strengths, but you don't just get rid of them. So the other misconception about management is that these ideas are not lucrative. And there was actually a study done by Scott Blanchard, who is now the CEO of Blanchard. He got together with one of the researchers, and they actually did a study of whether these concepts related to profit. And what they found was that it did, because if you have a workforce that has a positive culture and they're fired up about your vision and values, it actually benefits the bottom line. So that's got solid research behind it. So I think that's the biggest misconception, that you have to be, forgive my French, an asshole to succeed. You do not.
That's my favorite French word.
Yes.
Yeah.
Je ne parle pas français. Yeah. So, I remember when The Apprentice came out, and I'd been working with Ken for a couple of years at that point, and, looking at that management style, you're fired, and thinking, wow, I really wish I should go up to Hollywood and pitch a TV show, on the 1 Minute Manager or on the Servant Leader or whatever. And it's the opposite of you're fired. It's pulling someone aside and saying, how can I help?
Yeah, we could go down a whole political rabbit hole with that. But we're not going to do that because we're going to keep it positive and talk about Ken Ferguson.
Political commentary. This is not to have a political commentary at all. And Ken is not a political figure at all. And in fact, has role models in both parties and, catches people doing things right in both parties. But just to that point, for that particular television show and that particular management style is in such stark contrast. Donald Trump actually wrote to Ken at one point and asked him if he'd like to contribute to a book he was doing for Crown Publishers about golf. Because as you know, President Trump is a big golf fan. And Ken wrote him back and gave him a tip, and that was actually published in his book. So.
Yeah, I love everything I've learned about his, leadership from Ken. It's just phenomenal. And so what have you learned from him over especially in his latter years, about purpose, legacy, and resilience.
Purpose, legacy, and resilience. Purpose, what I've learned from Ken is that the concept of moving from success to significance, and that is not an original Ken idea. I think that was a book that was published in the early 2000s, From Success to Significance. But it's something that Ken really modeled that, especially once you achieve success, that really efforts should turn to what difference can I make with what I have and what powers I have and what I know, and moving from success to significance. I've also learned, I'm a person, Ken calls me very task oriented. I'm a person who really likes to focus on the task. And what I learned from Ken is how to be a servant leader in the moment. And I'll give you an example. I hate interruptions when I'm working. I tend to forget about relationships and really focus on work. I don't know if any listeners can relate to that.
I can relate.
And one day, Ken in his later years, he was in his office meeting with a guy named Mac Anderson. Mac Anderson was the person who founded Successories, which was the company that made, those motivational posters, endurance, courage, inspiration, so that was Mac's Successories. He had a whole product line of those. And he had come to see Mac. He had come to see Ken to talk about collaborating on a book. And they were having a meeting, and I was in there taking notes. And there was a knock on the door. And it was the widow of a beloved Blanchard employee who had passed away, unfortunately, recently. And Ken said, "Oh, I've been waiting to see you. Come on in," even though he was in the middle of a business meeting, right? And he introduced the widow to Mac, and then he grabbed his tape recorder. Ken always liked to carry a tape recorder with him to capture ideas, and this was before cell phones, right? Grabbed a tape recorder and he said, "Come on, let's go over to the warehouse where the widow's husband had worked. Let's talk to some people about your husband." And so for the next hour, Ken walked around the warehouse and talked to people and recorded their memories of what it was like working with the deceased person, their favorite memories, all that. And at the end of that hour, he took the tape out and handed it to her as a memento, as a keepsake. And to me, that is an example of somebody who just really gets that they're there for others. It's not about the important work they're doing. It's about being there for other people. And that's what Ken Blanchard models for sure, and models.
I'm getting chills throughout this conversation. It's just like so moving to hear these stories. So at 86, Ken is still living with tremendous purpose. What does aging well look like through his example?
Okay. Well, I wondered when we were going to get around to the aging well. And, the focus of this podcast really is about health and wellness. And this is something that Ken has struggled with for his whole life. The toughest part about writing this book was that Ken is such a nice guy that there's kind of like no conflict. And, I would ask people when I interviewed dozens of people, and I'd say, "What is Ken's flaw? Tell me what he does wrong." And they came up with crickets because he is such a nice guy. But that actually is his greatest flaw, because he has a problem setting boundaries and setting limits. And when you're always doing for others, you're not necessarily taking care of yourself. So that was a problem throughout Ken's life, particularly in the 1990s when he was flying all over the country doing speeches and trainings and things like that. He didn't take time to eat well. That was before there were gyms in most hotels. So if you're on the road, almost 300 days a year, it's really hard to take care of yourself. So he would put on weight. That was his tendency, to put on weight. And there's a story in the book about a men's group he was in, taking care of his mental health. And he had gained a lot of weight. His blood pressure was high. He was getting all these warnings from his doctor. And one of the guys in the group, who happened to be a psychologist, said, Ken, you're killing yourself. And he said, I'll get it under control. I'll get it under control. And he said, you always say that, but you never do. He goes, I'll tell you what, I want you to lie on the floor. And he's like, what? Lie on the floor? And he goes, yeah, I want you to lie on the floor. And he took a blanket that was sitting on the sofa, and he tossed this blanket over Ken. And he goes, okay, Ken, you're dead. You have eaten and worked yourself into an early grave. We're throwing the dirt on you. You are gone. And he let it sink in for a minute. And Ken started to pipe up, and he goes, no, you're dead. Whatever contribution you wanted to make, whatever thoughts you had about making further contributions, it's over. You can't do it. Forget about your family. Forget about your pets. You're gone. You're dead. And at that moment, Ken really got it. Something about actually lying there with the blanket over him. He really got it. Like, oh my God, I'm going to kill myself. And he started crying. And he said, what do I do? And he said, well, you got to work on some of these issues that lead you to overextend, which he purposefully did. He started really working on issues. But it was a struggle throughout his life. He wrote a book way back when called The 1 Minute Manager Gets Fit. In fact, he even appeared on the Today Show talking about how he lost all this weight, but then he ballooned back again. And finally, I think he was in London with his family, and his son, he was starting to get swelling in his legs because his circulation was so bad, and he was kind of gimping around. And his son, Scott, said to him, Dad, this is ridiculous. You always said that you wanted to be the guy on the bus in Hawaii. In Hawaii, when a tour bus stops, you see 35 women get off, and there's only 5 men because all the men are dead, right? Women live longer than men because men don't take such good care of themselves. And he said, you're not going to be able to do that unless you take this seriously. And finally, Ken figured out, I'm going to apply situational leadership to I need leadership. And he finally got a coach to work with him. And he wrote a book called Fit at Last, and was able to achieve his goal of being a 185-pound lean, mean golfing machine. And that was it. He finally figured out that he needed that direction in coaching, much more direction in coaching than he couldn't do it by himself. And he has maintained that. And I mean, honestly, I have to be truthful, Jeff. When I first started working with Ken and saw his condition, I really didn't think he'd live to be 86. I really didn't. I remember giving him like athletic gear, for his birthday, and subtly trying to do all those things. And I'm just so proud of Ken for taking care of himself. And I think all of us who love him are so happy that he finally took it seriously.
It's such a great message for all our listeners and viewers who want to age well. So
yeah, you bet.
It's easy, I think, when we are very other-centered, like Ken was, or is. I shouldn't say was. Why do I keep saying was?
Well, I know. Just past tense, but he's still around.
Yeah, very much around. So, he's, I talk a lot in anything that I write and with the other podcasts. We have a spiritual podcast, and even on this podcast, a lot about being other-centered. And that can be very, very difficult, because when we are other-centered, we are doing for others and we are sacrificing ourselves. And there's 2 things that can happen there. We either go the path that Ken did and neglect ourselves, or we get very defensive of ourselves and step back from that being other-centered. And so it's important that we find that balance in there, that and understanding that being more other-centered and leading others and being in a position to be able to lead others requires that we are going to take care of ourselves spiritually, physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially, so that we can do the things that we are purposed to do.
Exactly, which is why I love this podcast. I love your SPIES model. And in fact, it's so interesting. I swear to God, Ken did not plagiarize you, but he, when he turned 70, he used to joke, he had these older leadership role models. Norman Vincent Peale, who he wrote a book with when Ken was in his 40s, and Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, was in his 80s. they wrote a book together called The Power of Ethical Management. So that was one of Ken's role models. Zig Ziglar was another role model for Ken when he was younger. When Zig Ziglar, the great motivational speaker, turned 80, he invited Ken and Margie to his birthday party. And he, as he called it, he was celebrating the 59th anniversary of his 21st birthday. And Ken asked him, "So Zig, are you going to retire? You know, you're 80. And he said, "Retire? Except for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, nobody in the Bible made any impact until they were 80. I'm not retiring, I'm refiring." So when Ken turned 70 or was 70 in his early 70s, he wrote a book with a wonderful co-author, Dr. Morton Shavitz, called Refire, Don't Retire, How to Make the Rest of Your Life the Best of Your Life. And I swear to God, Jeff, that book was published 2013, maybe. I can't remember the dates. Ken's published he's published 70 books, so it's hard to remember all the dates. But that book models, it actually talks about, he only had 4 dimensions: spiritual, physical, intellectual, and emotional. Or as he called it, relationships. But those 4 areas, you need to fire up in all 4 of those areas to have a balanced life.
Yeah, and the whole SPIES model is not my original thought. I mean, I've coined it as well-centered fitness, just coming from an exercise physiology background. And I've adopted kind of those 5 components. And there's different, I think you can go as many as 7, 8, 9 different components of wellness, but I prefer those 5. But here's another shameless plug for my longtime friend, Jay Bernhard, who he pointed out to me, are you intentional about ordering it? You always say, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional. You know that spells out SPIES. Were you intentional with the acronym? And I'm like, I didn't even realize it spelled an acronym, but that's great. So we've now kind of latched onto that a little bit. So if he plagiarized from anybody, it would be Jay in regards to the SPIES. But yeah, I got to tell people, anything that I talk about is never an original thought. And most anything that we ever write about. I mean, I'm sure Ken's even the same way. I mean, he adopted ideas from Norman Vincent Peale, Zig Ziglar,
Absolutely.
Jesus, all these people. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's just rephrasing them in a way that they reach a new audience. You know,
right.
That's and trying to give credit where credit is due.
Right.
A lot of times, Ken is one of the most quoted people out there. If you Google Ken Blanchard quotes, you'll see all these quotes, and a lot of them are his original quotes, but a lot of them are things that he maybe said in a speech, but he was quoting somebody else. Many of them actually are his original. One of my favorites, he says, is, "Life is a very special occasion. Don't miss it," about being present. And
right.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you think there were any challenges? I mean, you've been talking a little bit about his health issues, but were there any challenges or low points in Ken's life that you think shaped his perspective on leadership in life?
Any challenges?
Challenges or low points. I mean, I know you talked about him having a very positive role model in his father.
Yes.
Couldn't have been all roses.
Yeah, and life isn't all roses, and it may look like, okay, here's this guy who everything was handed to him on a silver platter, but he's faced some, like all of us, he's faced challenges. In terms of professional disappointments, one of his earliest professional disappointments was when he was in college. He was, as I mentioned, he was studying to become a university dean. He really liked working with students and faculty. He did his doctoral dissertation on the relationship between personnel and administration. So he was very fired up about that. And he went to, he had interviews at several universities after he got his PhD. And a lot of them were very promising, particularly one at Dartmouth. And he heard crickets. Nobody called him back. And so he contacted the guy at Dartmouth that he'd had such a good interview with and said, "Hey, I kind of thought I'd hear from you." And he said, "Ken, I'm sorry, I should have called you, but you had a couple of really lousy recommendations in your profile." And Ken, this was in the days before the Freedom of Information Act, where people could just write something into your file and you wouldn't know what it was. And he said, "Really? What did they say?" And the guy said, "Well, one said, Ken's a wonderful guy, but don't let him anywhere near the faculty. He has no academic interest." What did the other one say? Yeah, pretty much the same thing. Ken's a wonderful guy, but not particularly intelligent. So this was devastating. Ken has a wife, a young child, and another one on the way, and no job. And so that was very devastating. He learned from his mom, who was also a leadership role model for him, that when something discouraging happens and you hit a roadblock, not to put your head down and mumble, but to keep your head up and look for opportunities. And so that's exactly what he did. You know, Ken's a very sociable guy, and he told people what he was going through. And one of his other professors said, "Hey, I know a guy who just became the dean at Ohio University. I'll see if he'll talk to you." And so Ken ended up flying out to Athens, Ohio. They hit it off, and that's where he met Paul Hersey, and they developed situational leadership. So, you know, it's that old thing of sometimes what the universe takes away, it gives back in a higher form. Sometimes those roadblocks are there for a reason. I remember when I was writing mystery novels, one of the things I learned from the late, great Sue Grafton was when you're writing and you hit writer's block, sometimes that is actually a blessing. That is your shadow knowing something that needs to happen in the book, and you just need to give your subconscious time to work that out. So it's not always a bad thing, you know. It's the old lemons to lemonade. Another setback Ken had, and this was in his later years, you know, I think probably 2007, he and Margie lost their home in the witch fires. We had these horrible fires in San Diego. They burned for days and days and days. Like over 1,100 homes were burned up. People lost their lives, major freeways. And so Ken lost a library of 8,000 books, you know, precious, priceless mementos. Margie was his wife, an amateur photographer, and even though she had backed up her photographs to a hard drive, it was sitting next to her computer. And that was, you know, she didn't know about the cloud yet, so all her photographs. And what Ken and Margie took away from that experience was that, first of all, the only thing that matters is who you love and who loves you, and what you've learned in life. You know, Ken used to quote a guy named John Ortberg, who wrote a book called "At the End of the Game, It All Goes Back in the Box." And it's based on a story of a kid who played Monopoly and learned to be a fierce Monopoly player. And he learned from his grandmother that no matter how many hotels and houses and how much cash he piled up, at the end of the game, it all goes back in the box. And so that really put that to the test for Ken and Margie when they lost all that. And then again, the universe did that thing where they had been planning to rebuild their house on the same lot. And in the meantime, there were some delays because a neighbor had objections. This house that they had loved and admired for years across the street happened to go up for sale. So they were able to get a bigger house with more square footage, better view, their dream home for less money than it would have taken them to rebuild. And Margie's big takeaway from that was, you know, she noticed that the only things that she got to keep were the things that she had given away. So after the fire, a lot of people started sending them things that the Blanchards had given them over the years. And they started getting all these things. To them, it was a demonstration of the replenishment principle, right? What you give away. Now, Ken's mother used to tell him, don't give with the intention of getting in return. But if you give from your heart, don't be surprised by all the good that will come back to you.
That's wonderful life lessons. This episode is going to be one that I will probably go back and listen to numerous times. So
I just, you know, to share, there's so much. Again, this is the motivation for writing the book, to be around such a wonderful human being. I couldn't not share his story with the world. And at the risk of sounding like I've written a hagiography is a puff piece, you know, and I did my best. I assure anyone who reads the book, I really, really tried to present a balanced perspective of who this person is. But he's the real deal. Yeah. He's genuinely wonderful.
So in this age of burnout, layoffs, work distrust, how can leaders practically quote unquote, catch people doing things right without sounding disingenuous.
Disingenuous, yes.
Disingenuous, what did I just say?
Well, okay. Well, let's speak to the work burnout and the explosion of tech that is so stress inducing. By the way, I loved your podcast on friendly tech for aging people. That was so timely and great. But a lot of tech just feels overwhelming. And one thing that leaders can do, particularly if you have a leadership position in an organization, is to create a culture of wellness. And that's something that Ken and Margie, when they started their company, they were leaders in this long before there was a term called wellness. They had a thing called the Infant at Work program. One of the founding associates of the company had a baby, and they decided, well, let's just have a program where for the first 6 months of a child's life, you can bring them into the office. And what they found was it really helped to reduce stress. It reduced the parents' stress, but also people got to take a break and go visit with the baby. And, it was a wonderful innovation. They had gyms and, health food at Blanchard long before that was a thing. And now, of course, you get wellness days off, just days off to take care of yourself. And, again, you might think, well, how can I do that and stay in business? But there is, you will find that the money you think you're losing, you'll make up for in loyalty and enthusiasm for your organization. So that's one thing. And in terms of catching people doing things right without having people roll their eyes, just be genuine. And really get in touch with in your heart when you give a praising to someone, actually think about it. Think about and let it sink in how that person is contributing to you and how that person is making your life easier. Be mindful that you're not doing this alone. You're doing this like publishing this book. Do you know how many people are helping me put this book out in the world? This is not about me, and to acknowledge those people who are making your life easier. And I think if you really feel it in your heart before you say it, and then again, be specific about what the person did and how it made a difference, just try it out. Just experiment.
Yeah, probably the best way to not sound disingenuous is to not be disingenuous.
Precisely.
Simple,
well
right?
said. Well said. Don't be and if you find if you're not able to do it without being disingenuous, then don't do it, Yeah.
So what can people, especially older adults, take from Ken's leadership principles to make a difference in their own families, communities, and workplaces?
What can people take away? People can take away that no matter what they're doing, particularly people who maybe you're past your working career age and you think, what usefulness do I have anymore in this world? Understand that what you do every day is leadership. And so you can take away the principles of leading with love. Basically, Ken always says, what is the question? Love is the answer. And leading with love is, again, it's about, I made a little acronym for it, the we. It's about influence, not authority. It's about working with people, doing leadership with people, not to them. And it's about empowering people, not controlling them. And just applying those thoughts every day as you go through life, even with your family or whoever you're encountering, that's valuable. And if you put that into practice, putting the simple catch people doing things right into practice, it's going to be transformative.
So what was the most surprising thing you discovered while writing his biography?
I think the most surprising thing to me, because, I met Ken when he was in his 60s. And so the most surprising thing to me was to find out how early this started for Ken, how far back these theories and these principles went. I talked a little about how he participated in school government. When he was in high school, and this was fascinating to me, he was at New Rochelle. He grew up in New Rochelle. And he was in school when the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down from the Supreme Court. So his elementary school, Lincoln Elementary, was actually a segregated school. But because Ken played basketball, he was a fantastic basketball player. He had a killer outside jump shot, and that his father encouraged. And basketball kept him fit for many, many years. But so because he played basketball, he had a lot of friends who were the black kids, and he did city leagues and things like that. And so he was always into diversity. He made many, many friends playing basketball. And then, so by the time he got to high school, New Rochelle High School, one of his good friends, who I interviewed for the book, Bobby Bradshaw, Ken calls him Bobby, I call him Robert, but they got together. Bob was black, Ken was white. They could see how siloed people were in their high school and how everybody was in cliques and racial and ethnic cliques. And so Bobby and Ken got together and created something called the Youth Fellowship. And the idea was to just bring all the kids together in the school to not only to communicate with each other, but to do things for the school together. And so one of the surprising things was coming across a newspaper clipping, which is in the photo section of the book. You can see this old newspaper clipping from 1956. Here's Ken and Bobby and an article on their youth fellowship. So Ken was way ahead of his time there. He taught one of the books that he taught used in his class when he was at University of Massachusetts was the autobiography of Malcolm X. He thought Malcolm X's leadership journey was profound. Malcolm X went from being kind of an angry, self-centered leader to more of a servant leader at the end of his life. And Ken actually, this was another surprising finding. These gems that when I was talking to Ken about that, he goes, "Oh yeah, Malcolm X's wife. I was actually on her doctoral dissertation committee, so he knew her well." Finding out that Ken's interactions, he was on an airplane once, and he was in first class, and suddenly they moved everyone out of first class to the back of the plane. I was like, what's going on? Well, apparently Air Force One was not available, and President Jimmy Carter had to take over the first class department. And so, Ken met Jimmy Carter, and he met President Truman when Truman came to Cornell, and it's just really interesting. He met Martin Luther King. There's a story in there about Ken was the usher the day that Martin Luther King came to speak at Cornell. And what really impressed Ken was how not only did Martin Luther King Jr. preach this message of love and serving others, but when he met Ken and his friend, he was so kind and thoughtful and other-oriented, and that really left an impression on Ken. All those kinds of things were fun to discover as I was writing.
So how involved was Ken in the creation of the book?
Ken did not. This was my book. I felt that it was very important to keep an arm's length distance. My concern was, again, that I'd be writing a hagiography. This is about Ken. It's not by Ken, although I draw heavily on his work, obviously, so that people can become familiar. After I completed the manuscript, I, of course, showed it to him so he could read it. And most of all, Margie, wanting to make sure that I got everything right, and several other people. And Ken read the manuscript and he said, "Wow, I'd really like to meet this guy. He sounds great." He might be doing some of the publicity with me. We'll have to see about that. He's really enjoying life at a slower pace. So, but he may be open to doing some things later on. We don't know. It's Ken loves to contribute in any way he can.
So what do you hope the readers take away from this biography, especially those that are nearing or in retirement?
I hope people take away from this biography that, first of all, if you're on a journey toward wellness, that it has a lot of highs and lows, and never give up, because Ken struggled with that for years and years and years. And there are a lot of stories and tips in the book about how you can actually succeed in that journey toward wellness. I hope readers take away, those who are nearing retirement, that just because you leave one job doesn't mean you leave having a purpose in the world or being a leader in the world, that your leadership continues. And again, I recommend Refire, Don't Retire, Make the Rest of Your Life the Best of Your Life by Ken Blanchard and Morton Shavitz, because it's a wonderful story about those areas that the wonderful Dr. Jeff Armstrong talks about, how important it is to fire up spiritually, physically, intellectually, and emotionally.
And socially.
That's right.
So do you have a favorite of his books? I mean, there's 70 of them, so that might be a hard question to answer, but.
Oh, a favorite of his books. Oof, well, wow. I do. And, I just finished editing the fourth edition of this book. It's called The Secret, What Great Leaders Know and Do. And it is basically a parable about a young woman who goes from being a overwhelmed, unintentionally self-serving leader to becoming a serving leader. And it's a really great story. It's sold hundreds of thousands of copies. I think it's on its way to selling 1 million copies. It's one of his successful books. But I love all his books. So if you haven't read The 1 Minute Manager, it's so easy to read. The publisher said he loved about the book was that it's a bathtub book. You can actually draw the water for your bath, get in the bathtub, read the book, and by the time the water is cold, you're done with the book. And there's a reason for that. Ken and Spencer Johnson, who was his co-author, they had done research and they found that most people never get past the first chapter in a nonfiction book. So they wanted to front load that book. They wanted to make it short and readable, and it contains great principles. It's now out in an edition called The New 1 Minute Manager, because obviously things have changed since it came out in 1982. But that's a fantastic book, and do yourself a favor and read it. You can apply it in your personal life, in your business life. Those principles apply anywhere.
Yeah, I'm going to go back and read that again and just see how much of kind of what I teach now, how I teach, how I lead, where I lead is influenced by that book. Because I read that probably a couple times. I know I read it early on in the 80s and probably read it again in the early 90s because I went through a period where I was just on a huge reading binge. And I was living at my dad's at the time and just kind of raiding his library of books and just trying to find everything and anything I could read. And so that was one of them. And then Servant Leadership is another one that's just a really great book. But we want to make sure people read the book. So where can the listeners and the viewers learn more about the book, your work? Where can they find the book and hopefully buy that book?
Anywhere where books are sold. It's available right now as we're recording this. It's available for pre-order from all the major retailers. I have a website, marthalawrence.com. And so it's pretty easy to find. And if anyone is interested in, some of the other management concepts that we were talking about, I encourage them to go to Blanchard.com, which is the company that Ken founded. And they can find so many resources there that I can't even begin.
Yeah, it'll be more productive for people to be scrolling through his list of books on Blanchard than scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or some of these other areas that we tend to scroll.
And actually Blanchard.com is about the company he started and more about management training. His books are available on kenblanchardbooks.com. That's his author website. So kenblanchardbooks.com.
And we'll make it easy for everybody. We'll put links in the description notes for that so that everybody can just click on it, go find the books, find more about Ken, find more about you, and do everything they need to do to keep aging well. So if Ken were sitting with us today, what do you think he'd say about the meaning of a life well lived?
What would he say about the meaning of a life well lived? Oof, I hate to put words in Ken's mouth, but I know for Ken, he's a believer and he wants to live a life. It's his mission in life to be an example of simple truths and to awaken people to the presence of God in their lives. And so I think he'd want the meaning of a life well lived is that by the end of your life, you get to the end and you hear, well done, my servant. I think that's what Ken would say about it. I don't want to think about the end of Ken's life.
No. I mean, we're just talking about a life well lived. He's got many, many, many more years of well living. So as do we all. So is there anything we missed talking about today? I mean, I'm sure you could probably pull up 1 million more Ken Blanchard stories that we could talk about. But again, people got to buy the book.
I think we've covered a lot. I was thinking, Rick, when you were saying that, when Ken turned 70, somebody asked him about that. Wow, Ken, you're 70. What does that feel like? And he said, one of my role models, Norman Vincent Peale, he passed away peacefully in his sleep at 95. So I figure I have at least another 25 years contributing to do. So
Easily.
Yeah. I could go on with a million stories, but I think that, probably that I've prattled on long enough.
Well, this was a very, very inspiring conversation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm looking forward to kind of reading through the book and probably pulling out a few more of Ken's older books and reading those as well. My reading list is growing.
Sorry, Jeff, I would love to send you The Secret. I think you'd really enjoy that book.
I'd love to. I'd love to read that.
Or I could send you, Ken also did a book called Servant Leadership in Action, where it's a compendium of a lot of different well-known people writing about what servant leadership is. So whichever of those sounds good to you, I'd love to send you a book.
That'd be great. Thanks. Well, just thank you again for your time today. This was incredible. I wish you all the best with the book and just with your continued writing. Just keep doing what you're doing and keep living a life well lived and keep aging well.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think you're fantastic and I appreciate everything you're doing. Right back at you.